Hi everyone, this is HKChess here, and in this video we're going to cover endgame number 11 of the book 100 Endgames You Must Know. So in this endgame we have knight versus knight pawns, and we saw in the previous video how to defend with central pawns, knight versus central pawns, meaning these four central files. And now we're going to see what happens if the pawn is a knight pawn, meaning the pawn on these two files. So obviously when the pawn gets closer to the edge, it creates more difficulty for a knight because of the fact that the mobility of the knight is a little bit reduced. But the same principle still exists, but it's a little bit different because of the mobility of the knight. So if the knight can get in front of the pawn, of course it is a draw, but if the knight cannot get in front of the pawn right away, it is a bit different than what we saw in the central pawn. So obviously in this position the knight cannot get in front of the pawn right away, so knight has to control the pawn laterally, and in order to do that, the knight has to get into one of those two circuits that we saw in the previous video. So if we just want to check it once again, if we shift everything one square to the right, we see that this pawn becomes a central pawn, and the circuit that the knight has to get to is either this circuit or e2, d4, b3, and c1. So obviously, if you take note that e2, c1, a2, and c3, and if you shift everything one square to the left, you see that this square disappears, meaning that this circuit will be incomplete and unavailable. So this is the only thing that black can use to win this endgame, basically. So let's see that now the correct move in this position is b2. And now knight tries to laterally control the pawn with the move knight d2. And now king has four options. King a2 and king a1 would be not ideal because you just let the knight stay there and you can never promote the pawn. The other two moves would be king c2 and king c1. As we saw in the previous endgame, each of these two moves would let the knight get into one of those two circuits. So we have to remember which one was which, basically. So if king c2, we saw that knight c4 and the knight would get to this circuit, and if king c1 would get the knight to the other circuit that is now incomplete. So that is the only thing black can use in this position. Now black plays king c1, knight b3, and now king c2, and there is nothing white can do here. Once knight can just give another check, and once king d3 happens, there is no checks, the knight cannot get in front of the pawn, and of course it is going to be a winning position for black. So in conclusion, if your knight can get in front of the knight pawn, it is a draw, but if not, you cannot laterally control the pawn. Of course, if your opponent plays this wrong with the move king c2 here, you can control the pawn, but that is not really guaranteed. You either let the knight capture the pawn, or just promote the pawn, and this would be for king and queen. So you have to be aware that even if you're the side with the pawn, you have to be aware how to play this. So what happens if you're the side with the knight and your opponent plays this wrong with the move here, king c2? So this is the only winning move in this position, and now this is a blunder. But how are you going to take advantage of this? The only move that is going to let white draw this endgame would be the move knight d6. And it is very interesting because you just get the knight way back the board and way away from the pawn, but it's not really that difficult for the knight to capture the pawn, because if now you advance the pawn, now knight c4 happens, and you either let the pawn capture the pawn or again promote, and this would be a fork. So in this position you cannot advance the pawn. But what else can you do? if king c4, you're just gonna go back with the idea that now black has 6 options. Any of these 4, you would just go back, because these 3 would just let the knight get into this circuit. And if king b2, you're just gonna play knight d2, and whatever happens in this position, you're just gonna capture the pawn, and this will be a draw basically. So what happens if king c2 or if king d3? If king d3, you're just gonna fork the king and the pawn and just win the pawn on the next move. And if king c2, you're just gonna go back, and you will be happy with the draw here. 2-4 repetition would result in a draw. So that's just it. So this is it. This is endgame number 11. In the next video, we're going to cover endgame number 12. And thank you for watching. See you in the next video.